In the twilight of a distant galaxy, where stars shimmered like diamonds scattered across an endless void, there existed a world cloaked in mystery and beauty. It was known as Lysera, a planet bathed in hues of violet and gold, its skies perpetually painted with auroras that danced like living spirits. The air carried the faint scent of blooming starflowers, their petals glowing softly under the light of twin suns. Here, amidst this celestial splendor, lived beings unlike any other. Tall, graceful creatures with skin that shimmered like liquid silver and eyes that held galaxies within them. At the heart of Lysera stood the grand citadel of Zindra, a towering structure carved from crystalline stone that refracted light into cascading rainbows. This was the seat of power for Queen Silvara, ruler of the Lyserans. Her presence commanded awe not just because she was queen but because her very essence seemed to embody the planet itself. She moved with an elegance that defied description, her voice melodic yet commanding, every word laced with authority. Her long, flowing hair shimmered with iridescent strands, catching the light as though it were spun from stardust. To gaze upon her was to feel both reverence and unease, for beneath her radiant exterior lay secrets whispered only in shadowed corners. The Lyserans revered her as a goddess incarnate, their devotion unwavering. They believed her lineage traced back to the first dawn, when the universe itself had taken form. But whispers persisted among those who dared speak them, the kind spoken behind closed doors or beneath the cover of night. Tales told of how she ascended to the throne centuries ago after vanishing for decades, returning changed, more powerful, and enigmatic than ever before. Some claimed she had struck a pact with forces beyond comprehension, while others spoke of rituals performed under blood-red moons. Whatever truth lay hidden, one thing remained certain. Queen Silvara ruled with an iron will veiled in velvet diplomacy. Her court was a spectacle of opulence and intrigue, filled with advisors whose loyalty teetered between admiration and fear. Among them were scholars versed in ancient lore, warriors clad in armor forged from meteorite steel, and mystics who communed with energies unseen by mortal eyes. Yet even they tread lightly around her, careful not to overstep boundaries invisible to most. For all her grace, there was an edge to her, a sharpness that hinted at something darker lurking beneath her polished facade. It was said that no one truly knew her, not even those closest to her. And perhaps that was why outsiders viewed her with equal parts fascination and dread. To some, she represented hope, the guiding light of a civilization steeped in wonder. To others, she was a riddle wrapped in danger, a puzzle too perilous to solve. But whether seen as savior or enigma, one fact could not be denied. Queen Silvara's influence stretched far beyond the borders of Lysera, reaching into realms unknown and shaping destinies unimagined. Amidst the cosmic marvels of Lysera, a lone human warrior found himself thrust into this alien realm through circumstances both extraordinary and harrowing. His name was Kael Draven, a battle-hardened soldier from Earth's outer colonies, where humanity eked out existence on barren planets and asteroid mining stations. Kael had earned his reputation not through brute strength alone but through cunning, resilience, and an unyielding determination to survive. Scars crisscrossed his weathered face, each telling a story of battles fought and lives lost. His piercing gray eyes bore the weight of years spent staring down death, yet they still burned with a fierce intensity that refused to dim. Kael's journey to Lysera began aboard the Eclipse Vanguard, a battered starship tasked with charting unexplored sectors of space. What should have been a routine mission turned catastrophic when the ship encountered a gravitational anomaly, a swirling vortex of energy that defied natural laws. Before the crew could react, the anomaly swallowed the vessel whole, tearing it apart piece by piece. Kael, trapped in the wreckage of his escape pod, drifted unconscious through the void until he awoke to find himself floating toward Lysera's shimmering atmosphere. The descent was chaotic, a blur of fire and turbulence, but somehow fate, or perhaps something else, spared him. When Kael finally regained his senses, he found himself lying on soft moss that glowed faintly in the twilight. Towering trees with translucent leaves swayed gently above him, their branches dripping with bioluminescent sap. The air smelled sweet, almost intoxicating, and the ground pulsed faintly beneath his fingertips, as if the planet itself were alive. Disoriented but alive, Kael quickly assessed his situation. He was armed only with a plasma blade salvaged from the crash and a tattered survival pack containing minimal supplies. Alone and stranded on an alien world, he knew survival would depend on his wits, and his ability to navigate the unknown dangers ahead. His first encounter with the Lyserans came unexpectedly. As he trekked through dense forests of crystalline foliage, He stumbled upon a group of hunters clad in sleek, metallic armor adorned with intricate patterns resembling constellations. Their weapons hummed with energy, and their movements were fluid, almost predatory. At first, they regarded him with suspicion, their luminous eyes narrowing as they circled him cautiously. Communication proved impossible. Their language flowed like music, incomprehensible to Cale's ears. But instead of attacking, they brought him before their leader, a tall, imposing figure whose presence exuded authority. Through gestures and crude attempts at mimicry, Cale learned that these beings saw him as neither friend nor foe but as a curiosity. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and soon emissaries arrived from Zindra, bearing ornate robes and ceremonial chains. Against his instincts, Cale allowed himself to be escorted to the citadel, unsure whether he was being honored or led into a trap. The journey took days, during which he marveled at the wonders of Lysera, the floating cities suspended by anti-gravitational fields, the rivers of liquid light that wound through valleys, and the colossal beasts that roamed freely under the watchful eyes of their keepers. Each sight reinforced the stark contrast between his war-torn homeworld and this realm of ethereal beauty. Upon reaching Zindra, Cale was ushered into the grand hall of Queen Silvara. There, beneath the cascading rainbows cast by the crystalline walls, he first laid eyes on her. She stood atop a dais, her silver gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail, her gaze piercing through him as though she could see into the depths of his soul. Though her expression remained serene, Cale felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Something about her, the way she carried herself, the subtle flicker of shadows in her eyes, hinted at a complexity far beyond what met the eye. And so, amidst the splendor of the alien court, Cale realized that his survival hinged not merely on adapting to this new world but on uncovering the truths hidden within its glittering facade. As weeks turned into months, Cale's position within the alien court grew increasingly precarious, caught in the delicate balance between servitude and suspicion. Queen Silvara, intrigued by the resilient human warrior, assigned him quarters within the citadel, granting him a semblance of freedom while subtly ensuring his compliance. Cale, ever vigilant, navigated the labyrinthine corridors with a mix of caution and curiosity, his every move scrutinized by the Queen's watchful guards and advisors. Despite the luxurious surroundings, he remained acutely aware of the underlying tension, a palpable current that charged the air with unspoken threats and veiled intentions. The Queen often summoned Cale to her private chambers, ostensibly to learn more about his world and its customs. These encounters were fraught with dual purposes. While she sought knowledge, Cale sensed her probing deeper, testing the limits of his resolve and loyalty. Her questions ranged from the mundane to the profoundly personal, each answer seemingly weaving him tighter into her intricate web. During these sessions, Cale noticed peculiar artifacts scattered throughout the room, ancient relics pulsating with dark energy, books bound in materials he couldn't identify, and maps detailing constellations unfamiliar even to seasoned spacefarers. Each item hinted at a history steeped in secrets, urging Cale to delve deeper, to understand the true nature of the Queen's power. One fateful evening, during a particularly intense discussion about the governance of Lysera, Cale observed a shift in the Queen's demeanor. Her usually composed facade cracked momentarily, revealing a flicker of vulnerability, or perhaps manipulation. Seizing the opportunity, Cale ventured a question about the origins of her rule, a topic whispered about but never openly discussed. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Queen Silvara's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Cale feared he had overstepped. However, instead of reprimand, she offered a cryptic response, speaking of trials and transformations that predated her reign, hinting at sacrifices made in the pursuit of ultimate power. This revelation sparked a relentless curiosity in Cale. Determined to unravel the mysteries surrounding the Queen, he began piecing together fragments of information gleaned from overheard conversations and clandestine explorations of restricted areas within the citadel. Late at night, when the citadel slumbered under the watchful eyes of fewer guards, Cale ventured into the lower levels, where shadows danced eerily on cold, stone walls. Here, he discovered archives sealed away, their contents guarded by complex locks and ancient wards. With each secret uncovered, Cale felt the threads of a larger conspiracy tightening around him, drawing him inexorably closer to truths that could either save him or seal his doom. As Cale delved deeper into the enigmatic layers of Queen Silvara's past, the revelations he unearthed began to paint a chilling portrait of ambition and sacrifice. Hidden within the dusty scrolls and encrypted data crystals of the Citadel's forbidden archives, Cale discovered records of an ancient ritual known as the Veil of Ascension. This ceremony, shrouded in myth and whispered fears, was purported to grant unparalleled power to those brave, or desperate, enough to undertake it. According to fragmented texts, participants were subjected to trials that tested not only their physical endurance but also their mental fortitude and moral compass. The culmination of the ritual involved a pact with entities from the void, a mysterious dimension beyond normal spacetime, inhabited by beings of pure energy and inscrutable motives. Queen Silvara's involvement in this ritual became apparent as Kale deciphered coded entries in her personal journals, accessed through a breach in the Citadel's security systems. The entries detailed her initial reluctance, followed by a growing obsession with transcending her mortal limitations. She described visions granted by the void entities, visions of Lysera under her absolute dominion, a utopia crafted through her enhanced abilities. However, these visions came at a cost. The texts warned of a price paid in essence, a part of one's soul forfeited to maintain the bestowed powers. The implications were staggering. The radiant queen, revered and beloved, might be tethered to forces beyond mortal understanding, her every decision potentially influenced by whispers from the void. Further exploration led Kale to a chamber deep within the Citadel, untouched by time and protected by arcane barriers. Here, he found murals depicting scenes of the ritual, showing figures engulfed in shadowy tendrils, their expressions twisted in agony and ecstasy. In the central mural, a lone figure stood transformed, radiating an aura of overwhelming authority and eerie detachment. Kale recognized the figure instantly. It was unmistakably Queen Silvara, her features altered slightly, more severe, her eyes pools of infinite darkness. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The woman he had come to know was not entirely human, or rather, not entirely of this realm anymore. Armed with this knowledge, Kale faced a moral quandary. The secrets he had uncovered could destabilize the very fabric of Lyseran society, possibly plunging the planet into chaos. Yet, withholding the truth meant condoning the continued manipulation of an entire civilization by forces they could neither comprehend nor control. As he pondered his next move, Kale realized that the path forward was fraught with peril. Each step he took deeper into the Queen's secrets wove him tighter into her web, making retreat nearly impossible. The weight of his discoveries pressed heavily upon him, a burden of knowledge that demanded action but offered no clear resolution. In the echoing silence of the Citadel's hidden chambers, Kale understood that his role had shifted from mere observer to potential catalyst. The truths he had unraveled were too dangerous to ignore, yet acting upon them required a courage that bordered on recklessness. As he prepared to confront the Queen once more, Kale knew that the stakes had risen exponentially. The beautiful alien Queen, with her mesmerizing allure and formidable power, now loomed larger than ever, a specter of both salvation and destruction. And Kale, the brave human warrior, stood at the precipice of decisions that could alter the fate of worlds. The confrontation unfolded in the heart of the Citadel, beneath the prismatic glow of its crystalline halls. Kale approached Queen Silvara with deliberate calm, his steps measured despite the storm raging within him. The weight of the secrets he carried pressed against his chest like an iron chain, each link forged from the truths he had unearthed in the shadows of her domain. She awaited him in the grand audience chamber, seated upon her opulent throne, her silver gown shimmering faintly as though alive with starlight. Her expression betrayed nothing, but her eyes, those vast galaxy-filled eyes, seemed to pierce through him, searching for cracks in his resolve. "You've grown restless, Kale," she began, her voice smooth and melodic, yet laced with an edge that sent a shiver down his spine. "I sense your mind is burdened. Speak your thoughts." Kale hesitated, the words caught somewhere between defiance and desperation. He clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the rough texture of calloused skin against his palms, a reminder of the battles he'd fought, the lives he'd lived. "You know why I'm here," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've seen the murals, read the texts. I know what you've done. The Veil of Ascension, it wasn't just a choice. It was a bargain. A deal made with forces you can't fully control." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint hum of energy coursing through the Citadel's walls. Then, slowly, Queen Silvara rose from her throne, her movements fluid and deliberate. She descended the dais, her gaze never leaving his. When she spoke, her tone was softer, almost tender, yet it carried an undercurrent of steel. "And what do you think you understand, Kale? That I am bound to shadows? That my power comes at a cost. She paused, tilting her head slightly as though studying him anew. Do you believe yourself capable of judging me? I don't claim to judge you, Kale replied, his voice rising slightly as frustration bubbled to the surface. But your people, they trust you. They worship you. Do they deserve to live under the rule of someone who owes allegiance to whatever it is you've tethered yourself to? Silvara's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Trust, she murmured, the word rolling off her tongue like a lament. Such a fragile thing, isn't it? Tell me, Kale, would they still follow me if they knew the truth? Would they stand by me if they saw the sacrifices I've made? For them, for this world. Her voice hardened, the melody giving way to something colder, sharper. Or would they turn on me, tear me down, and leave Lysera vulnerable to the chaos that waits beyond our borders? Kale opened his mouth to respond, but the words faltered. He thought of the Lyserans he'd met, their reverence for their queen, their unwavering belief in her divinity. Could they accept the reality of her power, the dark roots from which it sprang? Or would the revelation shatter their faith, plunging their society into ruin? The questions gnawed at him, twisting his resolve into knots. You don't get to decide for them, he shot back, his voice trembling with anger and uncertainty. They deserve to know, to choose for themselves. Keeping them blind makes you no better than the forces you claim to protect them from. Silvara stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, her gaze unrelenting. And what of you, Kale? What will you do with this knowledge you've gathered? Will you expose me, tear open the veil I've woven so carefully? Or will you walk away, let the illusion remain intact? She reached out, her hand hovering inches from his cheek, her touch lingering like a phantom. Tell me, warrior, what drives you? Is it justice? Revenge? Or is it simply the need to conquer another mystery, to prove yourself worthy of surviving the void? Kale recoiled, her words striking a nerve deeper than he cared to admit. He wanted to deny her accusations, to assert that his motives were pure, but the truth was far more complicated. He had come to Lysera as a stranger, an outsider adrift in an alien world. But over time, he had become entangled in its web, drawn to its beauty and haunted by its secrets. And now, standing before the queen, he realized that his choices were no longer just about survival. They were about legacy, about the kind of man he wanted to be remembered as. I won't let you use them, he said finally, his voice low but resolute. Whatever game you're playing, whatever hold these entities have over you, it ends here. Silvara's smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. Brave words, Kale. But bravery alone won't save you, or them. She turned away, her gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail. You think you've uncovered my secrets, but you've only scratched the surface. There are truths even I dare not face, paths I cannot unmake. And now, you've stepped onto one of them. With that, she raised a hand, and the chamber's lights dimmed, plunging them into semi-darkness. Shadows coiled around her form, writhing like living things, and Kale felt the temperature drop sharply, as though the air itself had turned hostile. He gripped the hilt of his plasma blade, its faint glow cutting through the gloom, but he knew instinctively that weapons would be useless here. This was no longer a battle of flesh and steel, it was something far older, far darker. Choose wisely, Kale, Silvara whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally, as though spoken by multiple voices at once. The truth you seek may destroy us all. As the shadows closed in, Kale realized that the confrontation was far from over. The Queen's secrets were not merely hers to bear. They were threads in a tapestry far larger and more intricate than he had imagined. And now, caught in the weave of destiny, he could only press forward, knowing that every step might lead him closer to salvation, or oblivion. The shadows surged forward, swallowing the chamber in a suffocating darkness that seemed alive, pulsing with an energy both ancient and malevolent. Kale's grip on his plasma blade tightened as he scanned the void, his breath quickening. The air grew heavier, pressing against him like a physical force, and the faint hum of the citadel's crystalline walls faded into silence. It was as though the world itself had been muted, leaving only the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching from the abyss. Queen Silvara stood at the center of it all, her figure barely visible through the writhing tendrils of shadow. Her silver gown shimmered faintly, catching what little light remained, but her face was obscured, her features blurred by the encroaching darkness. Yet her voice cut through the gloom with chilling clarity, each word resonating as if spoken directly into Cale's mind. "You've meddled where you do not belong," she said, her tone no longer melodic but sharp and commanding. "You think you understand the stakes, but your human perspective blinds you. This is not a game of right or wrong, it is survival." Cale took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, but his feet refused to obey. He couldn't leave, not now, not when the truth lay so tantalizingly close. "Survival," he shot back, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Is that what you call this? Binding yourself to forces you can't control, sacrificing pieces of yourself for power? What happens when they demand more than you can give?" Silvara's laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and hollow. "Demand," she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "They do not demand, they take. And I have given willingly, for Lysera's sake. For my people's sake." She paused, her silhouette shifting slightly as though she were tilting her head. "But you wouldn't understand. Your kind clings to morality as though it were armor, yet it only weakens you. You cannot fathom the choices I've made, the burdens I carry." Cale's jaw tightened. "Maybe I don't," he admitted, his voice rising. "But I know one thing. Your people deserve better than to be ruled by someone who sold their soul to the void. They deserve freedom, not chains disguised as protection." The shadows around Silvara coiled tighter, their movements becoming erratic, almost agitated. For the first time, Cale saw a flicker of uncertainty in her demeanor, a crack in the impenetrable facade she had maintained since their first meeting. Her next words came out strained, as though forced through gritted teeth. "Freedom is a luxury we cannot afford. Without me, without the power I wield, Lysera would fall. The void would consume us all." "Or maybe it already has," Cale countered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "How much of you is left, Silvara? How much of what you do is truly for them, and how much is for whatever it is you've become?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The shadows stilled momentarily, as if holding their breath, and for a fleeting second, Cale thought he saw something flicker across Silvara's face, regret, perhaps, or sorrow. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by a steely resolve that sent a chill down his spine. "You overstep, human," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I have tolerated your insolence because I believed you might be useful. But now," she raised her hand, and the shadows erupted into motion, swirling faster and faster until they formed a vortex around her. The temperature plummeted further, and Cale felt the hairs on his arms stand on end as static electricity crackled in the air. "Now you leave me no choice." Before Cale could react, the vortex surged outward, engulfing the chamber in a storm of darkness. The force knocked him off his feet, sending him sprawling onto the cold, crystalline floor. His plasma blade skittered out of reach, its glow dimming as it disappeared into the chaos. Panic surged within him, but he forced himself to focus, scanning the room for any sign of escape. Through the maelstrom, he caught glimpses of Silvara's form, distorted and elongated, as though the shadows were reshaping her. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, twin galaxies burning with fury. She raised both hands, and the shadows converged into a single, massive tendril that lashed out toward him with terrifying speed. Cale rolled to the side just in time, the tendril smashing into the ground where he had been moments before. The impact shattered the crystalline tiles, sending shards flying in all directions. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he searched for a weapon, anything he could use to defend himself. His eyes landed on a jagged shard of crystal lying nearby, its edges gleaming faintly in the dim light. Without hesitation, he grabbed it, feeling its sharp edge bite into his palm as he tightened his grip. The shadows reared back again, preparing for another strike, but this time Cale didn't wait. Summoning every ounce of courage and strength, he charged forward, dodging the tendrils as they whipped through the air. He closed the distance between himself and Silvara, his movements fueled by desperation. When he reached her, he swung the shard with all his might, aiming for the glowing core of energy that pulsed at the center of the vortex. The shard struck true, piercing the swirling mass of shadows. A deafening shriek filled the chamber, A sound so piercing it felt like it was tearing through Kale's very soul. The shadows recoiled, retreating rapidly as though burned. Silvara stumbled backward, her expression a mixture of shock and pain. The vortex collapsed, dissipating into wisps of smoke that dissolved into the air. For a moment, there was silence. Kale stood panting, the shard still clutched in his hand, his body trembling from exertion. Silvara gazed at him, her eyes wide with something akin to disbelief. Then, slowly, she straightened, her composure returning as though nothing had happened. "You are either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with something Kale couldn't quite place, respect, perhaps, or resignation. "Few have ever dared to challenge me so directly." Kale lowered the shard slightly, though he didn't release his grip. "I'm not here to fight you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I just want the truth. All of it." Silvara regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, she nodded. "Very well," she said quietly. "If you seek the truth, then follow me. But know this, Kale Draven, the path ahead will test you in ways you cannot imagine. And once you see what lies beyond, there will be no turning back." With that, she turned and began walking toward a hidden doorway at the far end of the chamber. The shadows parted before her, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Kale hesitated, the shard still clutched tightly in his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to walk away while he still could. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not after coming this far. Taking a deep breath, he followed her into the abyss, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. Whatever awaited him below, he was certain of one thing. The answers he sought would change everything. For him, for Silvara, and for the fate of Lysera itself. The staircase spiraled endlessly downward, its steps carved from the same crystalline stone as the citadel above. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a faint metallic tang that prickled Kale's senses. Shadows clung to the walls, writhing like restless spirits, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps reverberating through the narrow passage. Queen Silvara led the way, her silver gown trailing behind her like a ghostly wisp, while Kale followed cautiously, his grip on the jagged shard never wavering. As they descended deeper, the oppressive weight of the void became palpable. It pressed against Kale's mind, whispering in voices too faint to understand but loud enough to unsettle. He clenched his jaw, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing to keep the unease at bay. Ahead, Silvara moved with an eerie calm, her posture unwavering despite the suffocating atmosphere. She seemed almost accustomed to it, as though she had walked this path many times before. Finally, they reached the bottom. The staircase opened into a cavernous chamber unlike anything Kale had ever seen. The walls were lined with veins of glowing crystal that pulsed faintly, casting an otherworldly light over the space. At the center of the room stood a massive obelisk, its surface etched with runes that shimmered with dark energy. Around it, suspended in midair, floated fragments of what appeared to be shattered mirrors, their surfaces rippling like liquid mercury. Each fragment reflected not the chamber but scenes of distant worlds, some lush and vibrant, others desolate and barren. "This is the heart of the Veil," Silvara said, her voice echoing softly in the vast emptiness. "Here lies the source of my power, and the tether that binds me to the void." Kale stepped closer, his eyes drawn to the obelisk. The runes shifted and writhed as he approached, as if reacting to his presence. He could feel the energy emanating from it, a hum that resonated deep within his bones. It was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a force that defied comprehension. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is a gateway," Silvara replied, her tone heavy with resignation. "A conduit between our world and the void. When I underwent the Veil of Ascension, I bound myself to it, to draw upon its power and protect Lysera from the chaos beyond. But such power comes at a cost." She turned to face him, her expression haunted. "Each time I use it, a piece of me is consumed. And the more I rely on it, the stronger the void's influence becomes." Kale stared at her, the pieces finally falling into place. "That's why you've kept it hidden," he said. "You knew your people wouldn't accept this. If they saw how much of yourself you've sacrificed, how close you are to losing yourself entirely. Silvara nodded slowly. They trust me because they believe in me. To shatter that illusion would destroy them, and Lysera along with it. But you can't keep doing this, Kale insisted, his voice rising. You're destroying yourself. And for what? To maintain control? To play the savior when you're just another pawn in the Void's game. Her gaze hardened, and for a moment, Kale thought she might lash out again. Instead, she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as though burdened by an invisible weight. Do you think I don't know that? She snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. Every day, I fight against the pull of the Void, against the whispers that promise power but demand everything in return. I do this not for myself, Kale, but for them, for the people who look to me as their queen, their protector. If I falter, even for a moment, the consequences would be catastrophic. Kale hesitated, torn between anger and empathy. He wanted to hate her, to condemn her choices, but he couldn't ignore the pain etched into her features, the toll of centuries spent walking a razor's edge between salvation and damnation. Still, he couldn't let her continue down this path, not without trying to change it. There has to be another way, he said firmly. You don't have to carry this alone. Let your people decide for themselves. Trust them to stand with you, or find someone else who can share the burden. Silvara laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You underestimate the Void, Kale. It doesn't bargain, it consumes. Even if I were to step aside, it would find another vessel, another means to breach our world. My sacrifice ensures that it remains contained, for now. Then teach me, Kale blurted out, surprising even himself. Show me how to fight it, how to resist it. Together, we might find a way to sever the connection, to free you and Lysera from its grasp. For a long moment, Silvara simply stared at him, her galaxy-filled eyes searching his face as though weighing his sincerity. Then, slowly, she nodded. Very well, she said quietly. But know this, once you commit to this path, there will be no turning back. The Void will test you, Kale, in ways you cannot imagine. It will tempt you, break you, and try to claim you as its own. Are you prepared for that? Kale swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. He glanced at the obelisk, at the swirling runes and the fractured mirrors reflecting infinite possibilities. Fear coiled in his gut, but beneath it burned a fierce determination, a refusal to let fear dictate his actions. He turned back to Silvara, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve. I'm ready, he said. Without another word, Silvara extended her hand toward the obelisk. The runes flared brighter, bathing the chamber in a blinding light. The air crackled with energy, and the whispers of the Void grew louder, more insistent. Kale felt a cold wind sweep through the chamber, tugging at his clothes and hair as though trying to pull him closer to the obelisk. Place your hand on the stone, Silvara instructed, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Feel its power, but do not let it consume you. Resist the temptation, no matter what it offers. Kale hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the obelisk. The instant he made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, electrifying every nerve in his body. Images flooded his mind, visions of destruction and creation, of worlds born and dying, of beings older than time itself watching silently from the shadows. The whispers grew deafening, promising him strength, knowledge, dominion over all he surveyed. Through sheer willpower, Kale forced himself to focus, anchoring his thoughts to the present. He thought of Lysera, of its people and their hopes and dreams. He thought of Silvara, standing beside him, her own struggles a testament to the price of power. And he thought of himself, not as a warrior or a survivor, but as someone willing to fight for something greater than himself. Slowly, the visions began to fade, replaced by a profound clarity. The obelisk's energy still coursed through him, but instead of overwhelming him, it felt balanced, as though he had found a way to channel it without succumbing to its pull. When he opened his eyes, Silvara was watching him, her expression unreadable. You've taken the first step, she said. But the journey ahead will be long and perilous. We must work together to sever the tether, to banish the Void's influence from this world. Only then can Lysera truly be free. Kale nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever sacrifices awaited them, he knew one thing for certain. The truth had set them on a new path, one that offered hope, however fragile, for a brighter future. And so, side by side, the brave human warrior and the enigmatic alien queen embarked on their shared quest, determined to rewrite the fate of Lysera, and perhaps in doing so, redefine what it meant to wield power, to lead, and to endure.